Hello, this is Paul again. Course in Miracles. I'm talking again about A Course in Miracles topics. And today I'm going to present a rather controversial teaching. Because what I'm going to say is not believed by many people. It is not taught by many teachers. And there's a huge amount of belief and denial blocking this information from A Course in Miracles. Many people do not see it, and they do not understand why they don't see it, and they don't know that they don't see it. So the main topic is, what is the difference between heaven and earth? What is the difference between the thought system of God and the thought system of the ego? Why God could not create this world? Why A Course in Miracles is not non-duality? And how God thinks. Because really, I don't think people understand just how extremely opposite this world is to heaven, and how it's so unlike God's reality that even the way that people think here is not the same as how you think in heaven. So, excuse me. So, I'm trying to warm up here because it's freaking 35 degrees and it's raining and nasty and cold, so maybe we'll bring out the sunshine. So this world, this physical world, the earth, this universe, is everything this side of the separation from God, and the entire content of it is part of the ego thought system. We are inside the tiny mad idea. We are literally within the mind of the ego, and every physical object is governed by the ego's laws. Even the bodies, even this car, even the environment. It is all part of the mind. It's all part of the ego's entire system. Everything, the other side of the separation from God, which is heaven and God and his creations, are another thought system. And the two thought systems are completely different. Being a thought system, they think in a completely different way. They come to completely different conclusions. They reason and produce logic that is very different to each other. And this produces a problem. The problem is that we're all in this ego thought system world, and we keep using the ego and its thought system and its way of thinking and its way of reasoning and producing conclusions and making sense using the ego, and then we try to do that same thing with regards to anything that's on the other side of the separation outside the ego, assuming that it's like this place. It's so similar that you can think about it with this system's way of thinking and come to conclusions about it that are completely clear and true and make sense. And it's not true. The way that God thinks is so different to this world, so different to the fabric of this matter-based universe, which we've based all of our thought processes on, that thinking about anything to do with heaven, anything to do with God, sonship, creation, if you think about it with the ego's way of thinking, you have to come to false conclusions, because the ego is very divisive and separating and excluding, and it sees differences where there are none. It sees single things where there are many things. It's extremely blind to everything about God, and it cannot see God correctly, cannot understand God correctly, and whenever the ego is making sense of something, it actually means that the ego is making nonsense, because its reasoning is very logical, but insane. So I'm going to describe how this happens and what is the difference between fundamental differences between this world, which represents the ego's way of thinking, versus heaven and how God thinks. And as we contrast these two, you should be able to see why we're making significant mistakes in how we're understanding A Course in Miracles. We're coming to so many false conclusions, and it's leading to all kinds of side effects and misunderstandings and people saying things about the Course that are not true. So excuse me 1 second while I refresh. So the reason this is controversial is because A Course in Miracles is not non-duality, and it's been taught to be non-duality by many, many teachers. Everybody's bought into this bullshit, and the reason why they have is because it seems to make sense. And it seems to make sense because the ego's reasoning has concluded or has come to a logical conclusion that seems to suggest some idea of oneness, an idea of there's only one thing, or there's only God, or we're all one self kind of a thing. These kind of conclusions are half-truths, and they have produced this whole tidal wave of misinformation, and everybody's believing it because it seems to make sense. So let's find out why it does not make sense. So everything in this physical world is based on the idea of separation. This entire universe is an expression from the ego's thought system. It was based on the idea of being separate from God. It did not exist until that idea entered the mind. Every part of this world, I apologize for being a bit nervous. I'm nervous because I'm confronting some bullshit and believing that there's going to be resistance, because there probably will be. So let's say you have a physical, well, let's say, because the ego thinks with impeccable logic, and the Course actually says in Jesus' words that all of the ways that you go from separation through sin and guilt and sickness and death proceed according to very concrete steps that are all based on logical conclusions, based on the previous logical conclusions, and the result is death. So the same is true of the Holy Spirit's thought system, which is everything the other side of the separation, everything about heaven, is perfectly, impeccably logical in how it comes to certain conclusions, states of mind that occur based on those conclusions. So the fact is, if you can understand the perfect logic behind how you arrive at certain conclusions and how the mind has used logic to explain how separation's possible, and how even God creates using a system of perfect logic. You could say that all of the metaphysics in the Course can be perfectly derived from a starting point that's correct, and you can make logical conclusions based on that are perfectly consistent and completely true. And we've kind of done this with the ego. So in this physical world with objects represent ego thoughts of separation. So the ego takes a form, and the form looks like something, but not something else. So it looks different to something else. Let's see. Something else. So because this object seems to be different to this object, that means they're not the same object, therefore they must be separate. The entire universe is based on this principle that any kind of difference in form proves separation is real. So what we get is not just a thought system that's like separate from the body. You get a universe show up based on a way of thinking based on separation. So every physical object in this entire world is an expression of the idea of nothing is equal, everything's different, no two things are alike, nothing is the same, rules that apply over here don't apply over here. And therefore there's competition and conflict. So every single atom in this universe is fighting with every other atom by virtue of the fact that it's different too, and it does not share anything with any other parts of the universe. And in fact, the atom itself, or any particle of matter or energy, is the very idea of going away from wholeness and coming down to a little point that separates this point from other points. And every physical object therefore expresses ego laws based on how it thinks and what it results in. So what we get is, if something applies to one thing and it doesn't apply to something else, there's a breakdown in cause and effect. And if you remember that the Course says anything that's not love is murder, if something can apply over here but it doesn't apply over here, or if this thing here can cause this thing to have an effect without this thing being affected by those same consequences, this thing is getting away with murder. Because the whole idea of getting away with murder is I can do something to something separate, and because of the separation I can escape the consequences of that causality, and I can produce effects in something not myself and be free of the effects. That is a murderous idea. And all murder is based on that idea, even people actually doing it in this world. So you can say that every physical object that separates itself out and looks different and is in contrast to other things and presents an illusion of forms of not being identical, laws applying to a plastic bottle that don't apply to a glass bottle, laws applying to a banana that doesn't apply to an apple, just the mere fact that there's these differences is murderous, because it's putting a separation between things that should be joined, things that should be one, things that should be connected and sharing, because sharing is God's nature. So this whole universe is a picture of the crucifixion of God's Son. So physical matter itself is a picture of what does it look like if we separate everything out and make it so that everything is isolated. So this object is isolated from this object and isolated from this object. And so you have a world filled with parts and separations and divisions and things that do not overlap, things that don't share. No two objects can share the same space. I can't get my two hands to merge together into a oneness. Every single part of this world was created on purpose to show a picture of what does it look like when nothing shares with anything else? What does it look like when nothing is like anything else? What does it look like when what is over here does not apply over there? What does murder look like? What does death look like? Because all forms of sickness are also beliefs in differences and separations. So this whole universe is set up to be sick. This whole universe is set up to perpetuate death. And it's a dream of death. It's what death looks like. Not just the body dying, but death looks like separation, where something has become so isolated and confined and sectioned off from other things by illusions of differences that make it look like they're not connected and joined, to manifest this idea of attack and separation and sacrifice. Because in this world as well, the very form of matter is a form of sacrifice. Because say I take this bottle of liquid and I take some of the liquid out, the bottle now has sacrificed and has lost some of its liquid. So there's been a reduction, and just the idea that there's a finite amount of this liquid is totally an ego idea, an expression of there's a severe limitation placed on what exists, and there's only so much, and love isn't unlimited. If you want to give it to somebody, you have to lose it, you have to lack it. And so in this whole universe, based on physical matter, as you try to give anything, you have to lose. I can't give you my jacket without losing my jacket. We can't both share it at the same time, and there has to be loss. So not only is there this murderous underlying system going on here, there's also a sacrificial system of lack and scarcity and rarity and loss, and people not having enough and not having anything, and poverty, and this all comes from the ego thought system, the way that it splits something up, isolates it, separates it from everything else, and says, look at this thing here is a real form, and its form and its appearance are different to this other form, so these things can't be alike, so they can't be the same, so they are different, so they're separate, and they don't share anything whatsoever. This whole world is based on that, and it's based on it because this is how the ego thinks. It's not just a universe that just happens to be this way, or that forms just happen to be this way. It's expressed this way because the entire ego mind thinks this way. It splits stuff up, it separates, it isolates. So this is what you get. The structure of this system of reality, this physical universe, is based on the ego's way of thinking. Right down to the subatomic particles, down beyond quantum levels. The whole premise of this universe is to not be like God, to not have anything that's identical, nothing to be shared, and everything is separate. Now, God is not like this at all. God is not like this at all. His thought system is not in this world. His thought system is the other side of the separation, and it does not think this way, and it's not structured this way, and things don't happen this way. It's not laid out this way. There isn't physical matter at all, and nothing has been isolated in heaven. So the reason for that is because, and this is a very new teaching that I don't think hardly anybody's expressing. Maybe it's just something that hasn't become apparent yet, but God thinks holographically. And there's a line in the Course that speaks directly to this, that talks about how this is the way God thinks. And it says that the idea of the whole in every part, and every part is a whole, and yet every part also contains the whole. It's a holographic idea. I don't know if you know anything about how holograms work. I'm not talking about, let's pretend this is a hologram. No, that's not. This is not Hollywood holograms that objects are just projected in three-dimensional space. That is not a hologram. A hologram is a system where the whole expresses as a part, and yet the part is also a whole within itself. And the part is also sharing the whole. And there can be many parts. I'm not sure if I can go too deeply into how holograms work here, because it can be kind of hard to get your head around, but this is how God thinks, that God is this whole. God applies himself creatively to create a part. The part is a whole within itself. So now, in total defiance of the ego's making sense, we now have more than one whole. Sounds ridiculous to the ego. God creates souls directly, that each one of them is a whole. Each one of them has been fully created, is perfect, contains all of God's will, and yet is a whole within itself. And there are many of them that share. And so the fundamental property of heaven is that there is a huge amount of sharing going on, and that sharing does not mean there's only one thing. It does not mean that there's a oneness in the literal sense of there's only God. What it means is, like, okay, what Jesus says about revelation is that revelations are intensely personal, and they are communications directly from God to his creation. This can only happen in the context of heaven, because God cannot directly communicate outside of heaven. Therefore, he's talking about himself communicating with a creation, one of many, and that makes it personal because there are others that are not experiencing the revelation at the same time. And it even says the revelation cannot be directly shared with others because it is so personal. And that we are to bring the message of that revelation to others. There's so much fucking stuff in the Course talking about how there are many, many, many individuals in heaven. God, who encompasses all being, nevertheless created separate beings who have everything individually and want to share it to increase their joy. That's explicitly what the Course says. And this is hugely, hugely, hugely denied in the Course in Miracles community because of the ego's mind and its inability to see how this makes sense. Because the ego, if you remember, it isolates something, separates off the differences between the things in order to reason and logic. So it'll say like, okay, this is my left hand. I have a ring on my left hand. I only have one ring. Therefore, my right hand cannot have a ring on it. That's ego reasoning based on having split off in black and white terms the differences between these parts that isolate them from each other, so that it can say, if this, then that, or if this is that, then that's not this. That's the way the ego thinks. That's the way most humans think. That's the way almost probably every Course in Miracles student thinks. And it's not the right way to think about anything to do with God, anything to do with heaven or the sonship or his creation or his souls, or anything that the Course says about oneness, or anything to do with anything not of the ego should not be thought of with the ego, because all that's going to happen is you're going to look at a whole, look at oneness with this isolating mindset, and you're going to see isolations where there aren't any, and you're also going to see, or be incapable of seeing, how there can be many parts without it meaning that there's isolation. And this is what everybody is really stuck on. Every teacher that I've heard has said A Course in Miracles is non-duality, and there's only a oneness, and there's only one sun, and you've got one self, and we're all just sort of ego fragments of oneself, and there's not really many people. It's fucking bullshit. It is a mistake. It is the ego's conclusion about how it interprets something completely outside of its way of thinking and its mind. The ego's come to this conclusion that it makes perfect sense that if you reduce all the parts down and you take away the separations that it believes it has to use for logical reasoning, you end up with one part. And this one part is the boiling down of the entire ego's way of thinking, resulting in this idea of there's only one thing. And the ego then thinks, yes, I've been able to conceptually understand God's nature. I've been able to figure out the meaning of what God's like based on this logical reasoning, which seems to make sense. This conclusion that I've come to based on murder has resulted in people saying that the nature of God is non-duality. It is not. It is not a single thing. If you go from the idea of a single thing, a single isolated thing, God is one isolated thing, you can't get back to, you can't extrapolate from that conclusion to get back to encompass all the things that Jesus has said about the nature of heaven, you can't arrive at a sonship. There can't even be one son. There is absolutely impossible to go from saying there's only one thing, and this is oneness, and everything's one thing. If that's true, God is dreaming. If that's true, God's sitting here talking to a camera. If that's true, God is now insane and he believes in death. And if that's true, God doesn't even have the ability to create, doesn't even have the ability to add anything to existence, doesn't even have the ability to shine, because shining his inner radiance produces creation. So therefore, if he can't shine, and nothing real can exist unless it's shared, and you have to give in order to have something, it must mean that God does not live. God does not create. God doesn't have something that he shares. He's got nothing to share it with. Therefore, God is dead. That is the logical conclusion of this bullshit ego way of thinking about God and his nature, ending up saying God is just one thing. It means God is dead. It means God does not create. He can't have a son. Nothing else can come out of him. He can't have any thoughts. There are no angels. There's no Son of God. There's no sons of God. There's no sonship. There's no Jesus. There's no Holy Spirit. And there's no Trinity. All of that gets destroyed by this conclusion that the ego's come to, that it's reduced God down to a blob, one finite idea of a blob, sticking God in a box. You might as well stick him in a freaking coffin. So, and this happens over and over and over. Everybody's saying it, everybody's perpetuating it, everybody keeps stating that it's the perfect ideal of truth, and it's so helpful. It was sort of helpful for me at a time, because there was a time when I didn't have any idea of a sense of oneness, only believed in duality. Nobody had ever suggested something can be permanent or something is shared in a kind of a blended, let's both have the same thing at the same time kind of thing. That was mind-blowing at the time. And then the teachers came along and taught me that this whole world is duality, therefore there's something called non-duality, where the illusion of things being many things is actually one thing. But maybe there's still a world, and maybe the world still shows up. But that is sort of somehow, I still have a body, but somehow you can look at it in some special way that you don't think of it as a separate object, and it's sort of connected to the world. Bullshit. And then from there we got to pure non-duality, which is the idea that, well, let's at least embrace that there's no world, and let's say that because there's no world, there is only a oneness without the forms. So now we stripped away the duality part and got rid of the forms, kept the idea of the oneness, the one thing, and now we say that's the absolute maximum idea or concept of what God is one thing, and so God is one thing. And then the same people come up with the same idea, saying God has one son. How can God even have a son if he's one thing? And then they'll say, well, he does have a son, but his son is himself. They've just violated the logical reasoning there by adding something and then explaining that it's not really been added because it's added, but it's not, because God's both of them, and there's not really a both, there's only one. So why did you even bother saying that there was two things? You should just say there's only God. And people do say that. And there are things in the Course where Jesus at times talks about a specific aspect of heaven's holographic nature, which includes a sonship, and Holy Spirit as a spirit, and Jesus and us as individuals with free will. And I'm going to do a video on free will because this really taps into it. At times, Jesus speaks about individual sons. At times, he speaks about individual egos, which each soul has their own ego. At times, he talks about the aspect of the hologram that is shared, and that aspect is referred to as the one Son, or Christ. People then assume, with ego thinking, that if you've got lots of sons and they're all part of the one Christ, in ego reasoning, it makes sense to say, therefore, their multiplicity is an illusion, and really there's only one Son there, which deletes and cuts off all of the souls that God created, of which there are over 250 terms in the Course talking about specifically and directly God created many. All the minds God created, God's souls, God's children, God's thoughts, the aspects of the sonship, parts of heaven. There are hundreds of statements testifying to the fact that God has created many individuals, and they are real, and they're permanent, and they're part of reality. They're not an illusion. But because he sometimes speaks of aspects and certain levels or portions of the whole creation, people come to false conclusions with their egos, thinking that it means, well, God only has one Son, and yet if all the sons of God can be considered to be part of the one Son, then they must also be sons of God. Or I and the Father are one. They take it and they fucking mangle it because they don't understand that they're not having impeccable logic. They say, okay, I and the Father are one must mean if I'm here and the Father's here, but we're one, there's only the Father. And that is not what it means. That's a mistake. That's the ego's thinking, that it cannot comprehend how there can be a Father and a Son, and that they share something without it meaning that they're both isolated, and without it meaning that there's only one of them. It just can't get its head around how there can be any kind of sharing of anything. To the ego, sharing is absolutely nonsense. And so when you look with the ego at the nature of heaven, all you end up doing is coming to false conclusions, and your mind isolates things off and sections them off and compares them to each other and comes to egoic conclusions that are false. They're totally fucking false. I and the Father are one does not mean there's only the Father. It means literally there are two things, but they're sharing. They have a oneness. Oneness does not mean there's one single thing. Oneness does not mean there's only God. God is creative, and God has created infinite children. And he's created angels, and he's created the Holy Spirit. I mean, we're kind of racking up the numbers here. There's a lot of stuff in heaven that is completely ironed over and ignored by this non-duality idea, which is a nice little, helps you up to a point, but is so vaguely generic and so limiting and limited, because it's the ego's idea of what does it look like when I get down to one thing. It glosses over the creation of God, kills the sonship, renders God insane because he obviously had to dream of this nice cold weather that's happening, and makes him a murderer, makes him the cause of separation, then there's no free will. There's many, many statements that say that there has to be free will, and even God himself does not go against your will. And if you want to, you don't even have to wake up. You can delay as much as you damn well please, because God is never, ever going to force you to do anything against your will. So everybody's really struggling with this, because not only are they getting told there's only one thing and it's oneness and it's God and nothing else exists, and therefore there's no sun at all, and there's no sonship and no souls and nothing, and the course is non-duality. Never claims to be non-duality itself. That's something that other people have put onto it, and it's the only concept that they have within their ego way of thinking to describe what must God be like. Let's take out all the separations. Without any separation, there must be this one big kind of thing. And it's a very, very poor limiting concept. It does not comprehend, or nor can you take it and say, how do I get from this to there being a dream? How can I get from this to people dying? How can I get from this to Paul is on a camera showing a body? You can't get there, because if there's only one thing, God is looking at himself on a camera, and God is over there committing suicide, and it's completely ridiculous. You have freedom. Everything in heaven has freedom. God has given his freedom so fully as to fully put you out there independently, to the extent that he's putting no limits on you, and he's not stopping you from doing anything. He's given you freedom. And this idea of even having free will is practically taboo in the Course in Miracles community, because everybody's thinking with the ego and not understanding that it is possible for there to be many things in reality without it meaning separation. Separation means isolation that cuts things away from each other and puts up artificial walls to stop sharing. It does not mean that sharing between many individuals, or individuals being alike each other, or there being a quality or a brotherhood or a sonship, does not mean separation. Separation is isolation and imprisonment. It is the Son of God, many sons of God, using their mind to dream of, how can I put myself under tyrannical rule and be imprisoned in a fiction? God creates. God has created many individuals, and they are real. And by individual, now we have to redefine what does individual mean, because the ego's idea of what that means is false. It does not mean you're isolated. It doesn't mean you're in a prison cell. It doesn't mean there are walls up stopping you from sharing. What it means is you're free. What it means is you are a whole within yourself, but you also simultaneously share with the whole. And this sharing, this kind of mutual loving, does not delete your individuality, and it does not stop you from having your own will. You're supposed to willingly want to share God's will, and you can't do that if you're some kind of just an effect of God that can't choose on its own. Jesus says the mind is the mechanism of decision. You've been given your own mind. God has created many minds, and it even explicitly says that in the Course, if you actually read it yourself and don't listen to everybody else's crap. God has created many minds, and each one of those minds has the freedom to choose, and God had to give them freedom so that they could freely want to do His will. So it's not like, and it even says we're co-creators. I mean, it literally says we co-create with God because we freely, willingly desire to, want to express in the same way or in the likeness of our Creator. So we need to get away from this idea that oneness means one thing. It does not mean one thing. It means sharing, and it means ego-defying creation, ego logic-defying creation, where if you give something, you don't lose it. It increases. The ego says that's absolutely nonsense, but it's what happens in heaven. God gives Himself to His creations fully, does not lose something of Himself, doesn't run out of resources, puts it out there and increases creation by doing so, by adding you to creation. And the ego just cannot understand, how can I take a whole and produce another whole that overlaps and shares and has some kind of unity, while still maintaining that there are two things, and it not meaning separation or isolation. If you can understand how holograms function and the structure of them and why it's possible for there to be parts that are whole within themselves, but they also contain the whole, and there can be many of them, you'll get a much, much, much better, clearer picture of what Jesus means whenever He talks about anything to do with not the ego, anything to do with sonship or Father or creation or sonship, the Holy Spirit's thought system. It makes far more sense when you can realize that He's talking about simultaneous individuality and wholeness, and that this is God's nature, because God is creative. God doesn't just sit there as a fixed thing that doesn't express and doesn't increase anything and doesn't think. God is alive, loves to express Himself creatively, loves to take joy in applying Himself by creating individuals who are whole within themselves and lack nothing, perfect lights in heaven, your souls that are real. It is ego-defying. And everybody's using the ego to trust the ego's way of thinking with this world, thinking murderously, thinking with this thought system about a thought system that functions very differently, with different laws, different rules, different logic, different reasoning, and trying to make conclusions based on that. And it's so blind, it's so distorting of A Course in Miracles. It results in saying everything's a oneness, and the Course is non-duality, and there's only God and there's nothing else. Or some people allow themselves to indulge a little bit of separation by saying, oh yeah, God has a son, but it's only one of them. You know, I can accept that there's been maybe a little bit of separation there and we can have a son, but you're not allowed to have many, because that doesn't make sense. And other people would take it even further and say, well, yeah, there's a son, and he sort of has parts, and there's sort of a sonship, but there's not really any individuals because that's an ego idea. In other words, isolated individuals is an ego idea. And people just cannot grasp this, how it's possible that there can be many wholes, that there can be many parts, many creations, many thoughts, many minds, many dreamers, that this world does not just have one dreamer. Okay, this is a perpetuated myth that if you boil it all down and you get rid of all the individuals and the separations, you're going to end up with one individual. No, no, no. No, no, no. In the fall from heaven, some of God's creations chose to believe the illusion of separation, the tiny mad idea, and went into it and fell from heaven, and not all of them did. Many of the angels that God directly created, which this it says explicitly in the Course, God created the angels. Some of them went into the separation idea, some of them did not. Some of the souls went into the separation idea, some of them did not. Some of them were sent later to try to help the ones who had gone into it to come back out and couldn't do it because the attack was so strong, so they had to be brought back to heaven. And even the angels came and tried to help, but they couldn't because people wanted to be separate. And people can't get their heads around how there can be multiple dreamers of the same one dream because they don't understand how people can overlap, because they're sharing. Minds share, and they have this oneness thing that doesn't delete their individuality, but it's kind of like you merge with others, you unite with their minds, you share, and you're like them, you're identical. And so if you're sharing that same idea, you're sharing the same will to be separate and dream. The Holy Spirit says this is a collaborative adventure. We've dreamed together. Collectively, many, many minds have elected to co-create this universe of separation. There isn't just one dreamer, but there are statements that seem to say so, because sometimes Jesus talks about aspects of the creation. Sometimes he talks about what seems to be the parts of creation, the individual sons. Sometimes he talks about the unity of those sons as if they're one son, and how God communicates directly with his one son, which really means he also communicates directly to all sons, because it even says 250 odd times God directly created many. So the idea of putting a son in between, like a one son is in between God and the other sons, is wrong. There's God, there's huge numbers of souls, but because the souls are all sharing with each other and experiencing a sense of wholeness, and they're also all sharing with God, there's a collaborative willingness. And there isn't one dreamer of the dream. There isn't just this one son, as if the entire sonship, all of heaven, went into the ego. No, it did not. Jesus even says that only a part of your mind has gone into the dream. There's more to heaven than just the parts that separated, and you have to get this idea, this fundamental idea into your mind, that the thing that defies all ego logic is the idea of sharing. It's the idea that this object can exist in the same place as this object and share the same space, that physical separations do not keep things apart. All illusions of bodies and forms and objects are designed by the ego to make it look like everything is isolated and separated from each other, distinguishing differences that prove hell is real. And it's not true, because you need to realize that even your body is a form that you've made to try to separate yourself from the whole by making it look like you're just this one little part. So that, okay, Paul does not look like that person over there, Paul does not look like that person over there, therefore they must be separate because they're different. That's an attack. These forms are made as attacks on God, and our mind needs to overcome the illusion that this is presenting, not buy into the appearance of form. There's nothing so blinding as appearance of form. The appearance of differences and isolations needs to be overcome so that you can not identify as a physical object, so you don't confine yourself down to a little part, to a body, and you experience the expansiveness of wholeness that you, as an individual free-willed soul, share with all of the rest of creation, because everything in heaven is shared, and it's only possible to be shared because there's something to share it with, because there are many parts. This whole non-duality thing came from Eastern ideas and other traditions that said, with ego reasoning, hey, we don't have a duality, therefore there's a oneness, and we don't even have the duality part, so there's only a oneness left. That's what the ego says. The ego has come up with this idea of non-duality. The ego has come up with the idea of this one thing using its thought system and its way of thinking, because it's totally blind to what God is really like. God is not just one thing that doesn't have parts and doesn't create and doesn't live and doesn't think and doesn't love and doesn't share and doesn't have many sons and doesn't create a sonship and hasn't created any angels, and they're all just metaphors, bullshit. They're not metaphors. The ego does not have the ability to think the way it thinks exclusively and separatingly while looking at God's creation and be able to understand it, because it's going to cut off a piece and label it as separate, and then it's going to say, well, there's some sharing going on here, so there can't be a separation, so let's make it one big blob. Fundamentally, this entire universe, the ego's thought system, the way that we typically think, is egoic and excluding, and the way God thinks in his universe is inclusive, and there's a lot of sharing going on, and there's a lot of everything's alike everything else. There's no differences, there's no inequality. There's perfect equality. All God's sons are treated equal. And therefore, I am completely alike you. And that's what being one with you means. It means we are of one kind, not one thing. We are similar. We are made in God's image, and God only has one image. So we all have to basically be identical to God. And yet many of us, and the ego's like, no, something's going wrong here in the logic. There's a malfunction. And throws up angry attacks to fend it off with crappy, badly reasoned beliefs. I think a lot of people really struggle with having impeccable logic and understanding this stuff, because The ego is so ingrained in how it thinks, they don't even think about how maybe even the way that I'm thinking about the Course and the kinds of thoughts that I have and the way they proceed and the way that I reason logic might not even itself be conducive to understanding God's nature, and I might have to actually learn to think like God thinks. That's even said in the Course. You need to learn to think like God and not think like the ego. But everybody, probably 99.9% of Course in Miracles students and teachers, are thinking like the ego about things that are not of the ego, and drawing conclusions and putting up strong defenses against God's creation and his sonship and the manyness of heaven, which is natural. That's what a natural grand division means, is God's inner self is whole and complete within itself, and yet he radiates joyfully to create and share. That creation goes out, and yet because it's the effect of him, it is naturally divided from his inner complete self, because he's created something else that has freedom, has as much freedom as he does, perfect, total freedom, to independently choose whether or not to do God's will or not. And it's only because he's given you that freedom that you can even choose to dream. You wouldn't be able to even dream or have a tiny mad idea of impossibilities if God hadn't given your mind the freedom necessary to be able to willingly want to do God's will. So I might have to wrap up pretty soon here, but so the Course is not non-duality, because if you start with non-duality, you give it to a stranger and say, oh yeah, Course in Miracles is non-duality, what does that mean? Well, it means there's only one thing, and there's nothing else, and there's no separation, and therefore there are no sons, and the Son of God is dead, and God is not alive, and he doesn't share with anybody, and he's selfish, and let's see what else. That God made the world. This world is so opposite to God's creation. There's a nice part in the Course that says, I can remember how it starts, that God only has the ability to have one kind of thinking and one mind, and he can only create one mind, and the one mind can only have one outcome, and the outcome has to be like him, and that's why he creates heaven. And God is not capable of having a different train of thought that's not like the other train of thought, that results in a sad, sorry world called Earth, and he even calls it Earth, that is opposite to heaven in every way. That God would be insane if he could create heaven and earth, so they can't both be real, otherwise God's nuts. So that means, everything about this world, and there are people out there who fervently believe God has created bodies, God has created this world. Somehow, if you wrap your mind around that, your mind or your perception can be changed in a certain way, you can look at it in a certain way where you'll still see the physical that God made, but in such a manner as to not think of it as separate stuff, even though it's still showing up as differences. There's some really extraordinary beliefs out there that are not in line with what the Course says in its own words, and it's saying this universe cannot have been created by God because its nature is so unlike the nature of God, the way that he thinks and his inclusiveness and the way he shares, the way that there's a unity and a oneness, and how there can even be, no sacrifice, how there's no murder, nothing's different from each other, there's no something that something has that something else doesn't have. This whole fabric of space-time is an ego idea. It is not like God. God did not create it or think it, and it doesn't function how God thinks and creates. And everything in it is trying to wake up from it, using it to think about God's nature in a wrong way, and coming to all these false conclusions. God being a oneness is a false conclusion. It's not accurate enough. It is too blind. It's only seeing part of the truth and separating the rest of the truth out. It is true that there is a sharing. It's true that there is a oneness of sorts where two things are sharing an experience. And then people read a statement, oh, there's only nothing outside of God, therefore there's only God. Well, no, because now you've destroyed the sonship, and now you've gotten rid of the Son of God and turned him into a metaphor for some aspect of God that just happens to sort of think by itself. But if even an aspect of God had the freedom to choose against himself, it would pull him into the dream and he would become dead. It makes no sense. God has given you freedom. It's an extraordinary world in heaven. It's not like this world, and it doesn't think this way. There are many parts to it. There are aspects. There are suns. There are multiple creations, and even the suns have creations. And they're not like enforced by God. God's not there saying, you must create this, and I'm going to force you to do it. He's given you freedom. And it's a beautiful gift of freedom. And this beautiful gift is being shitted on by most of the Course community who does not want to see this or accept it. That the way they're thinking about God is fundamentally false, fundamentally arriving at false conclusions, is glossing over huge sections of A Course in Miracles and turning them into metaphors and fiction and parts of the ego. And it's really destroying things in that sense. So we need to learn how to think differently. We can't keep thinking about God and his nature using the ego's way of reasoning and thinking and coming to logical conclusions. Just because something makes sense does not mean it's real or true. Just because the ego can arrive at a logical conclusion of, oh, there must be only one thing, doesn't mean it's sane, and doesn't mean that that conclusion is part of a sane thought system, or that the ego even has the ability to arrive at a conclusion that is all-encompassing and true. It is not capable. We have to get out of ego thinking, out of ego reasoning even, to have a different kind of mind, a different kind of thought system that proceeds according to ego-defying laws, ways of thinking that don't seem to make sense to the ego. You know, if God says, well, if you want to have something, you have to give it away, and yet as you give it away, you don't lose it. It just increases. Makes no freaking sense to the ego's way of thinking. It's like, how can I give something and not lose it? And how can it increase? And how can ideas increase by being shared? And God's kingdom's not like this hellhole. God's kingdom doesn't have isolation in it. God's kingdom doesn't have separated off, sectioned off things that don't share with the other parts. It's only the lack of sharing that's the problem here. It's not that there are parts. Having parts, having individuality, having a self is not a problem. It does not mean that you've cut yourself off from God. It means that you are a kind of self that shares very openly and has a oneness experience with the whole. That's the proper definition of an individual, not a split off thing. It's only when we've tried to isolate ourselves from sharing with the whole that we've turned ourselves into a separate excuse me, a separate thing. So, just because you have individuality does not mean you have an ego. Just because you have individuality does not mean you're separate. Having a soul, which is God's creation, permanent creation, beautiful creation, does not mean that you're egotistical. Being egotistical means that you start trying to believe that you're special, and you want something to be different over here and over here, and you want different rules to apply to that and this, and you're trying to make differences emphasized. That is the ego. It's not the fact that you have a self. And for a long time I believed, everybody's saying there's only one self, and therefore you don't really exist, and therefore you don't exist in heaven, and there's only one sun, so there's this super abstract sun that I can't even relate to, who's the one dreamer of the dream. And that causes depression, because you are literally denying your soul. You're denying that you're a son of God. And when I finally saw this, and I finally got to where I could understand the holographic nature of God and why he thinks the way he does and how he creates, and why it's actually true that he has created many, many sons with free will, I cried, because it finally acknowledged that I am a son of God. And just this idea of we're all the son of God, that's only part of the truth. You also have a self. And if you deny that self, thinking that it means you have an ego, or that it's the same thing as an ego, it makes you feel like you're deleting yourself from existence. And all these non-duality teachers and Eastern teachers and other gurus from other traditions who are coming in and saying, and getting quoted as saying, there's only one self, and you wake up to no self, and your self disappears, and all this shit. The ego self disappears, not your soul. The false sense of isolation disappears, but it does not undo the freedom that you have as a soul to share with the whole as one of God's perfect creations. And so when I saw that, I was like, yes, for fuck's sake, I am a son of God. And just that recognition and that allowing myself to accept that there are many sons and I actually am one of them made me sad and tears of joy and angry temporarily at the people who had been perpetuating this myth, this soul-destroying myth, that you don't have a soul. You're not one of God's sons, essentially, that you're just part of some big sort of shared blob that has one mind and does all the dreaming, and everything about you that's self is going to get deleted. It's horrendous conclusion, and so many people are believing this and perpetuating this and teaching it and saying it, and it's becoming a really commonplace thing now. Everybody's saying A Course in Miracles is this non-duality, and it's total shit. God loves you directly as a soul, can give you personal revelations because you are directly coming from him, and he's able to take his... Okay, sorry, I ran out of space there, so I'm going to have to wrap up really fast because I'm running out of storage, but there's a different way of thinking about A Course in Miracles. People are misperceiving the Course itself because they're looking at it with the ego. We need to learn how to see it differently. We need to look at how God thinks and adopt his mindset and the laws and the rules of reasoning that he thinks with, that have produced his creation, including you as individual souls, free-willed souls, who have your own creations that you freely, willingly created, including those angels, we need to put the heart back into A Course in Miracles, because it's been taken out by all of this false logic that has come to these canceling conclusions that so many people are now just taking it on and just saying, yes, this is the ultimate truth. This is the highest truth I can get to. This idea of oneness is the maximum concept I can possibly conceive of with my ego. Therefore, that must be what God's like. And there's something beyond that. God is holographic in his creation, and his wholeness can come down to your part without coming down to another part to give you a revelation as a direct communication between him and a son without communicating directly to another son at the same time, because revelations are very personal. So you can exist as a part that has a personal, direct communication with God that isn't necessarily of others or including others, and yet you are to then share that with others because they're also having their direct communication with God. And we're all brothers, okay? If there's no sonship and there's non-duality, there's no brotherhood, the sonship is dead. You don't want that. You don't want the consequences of what's going to come from the kind of reasoning that starts with non-duality. It's a very poor concept of God's creation. It's not a good fit. Everybody is falling into the same traps based on the same reasoning and the same logic, and there's a better way. So I could go on about this at some considerable length, and I probably will do other videos about this too, and I want to do a video about free will because this is also something denied and cancelled by non-duality. So that's probably going to be my next video. I hope this is in some way making sense. I'm going to make some diagrams at some point to help understand the holographic nature of creation. But we need to really listen to what Jesus himself has written in the Course and stop listening to all these other people telling you stuff that's not true, okay? A Course in Miracles is much different to what many people believe it's saying. And a lot of the beliefs have come from the ego about the Course, and we're not getting the message. God is creative. God infinitely creates infinite individuals with free will, and you're one of those, and yet you share with all of the rest a sense of oneness, a sense of kinship and likeness and equality that does not cancel out your individual freedom. You've been created in a miracle. You think the ego can understand a miracle? God is miraculous, and his creation is miraculous, and it is possible that you have been created as an individual without it destroying heaven and without it being an ego thing. So I will go into this more at some point, but I have to get going, so I apologize for my frustrations, and I will do a forgiveness on this. Hopefully some of this at least opened you up to some ideas of thinking differently and looking at this differently. You are one of many sons of God, and God loves you directly. So, until next time. And yes, this is controversial because it's not being taught. Nobody's saying it. Nobody's pointing out the elephant in the room here. The ego's way of thinking about A Course in Miracles has led to many misunderstandings. And so I'm trying to help to clear this up and to show you how, and if you even go and look for yourself, you'll find that the things I'm saying are there, and they make sense, and they make much more sense when you take the holographic model of creation and you accept it instead of fighting with it with the ego. we're supposed to accept everything Jesus has said in quite a literal sense without trying to figure out why it makes sense to the ego. Okay, so otherwise you don't have any faith in Jesus' word. Are you going to trust him that what he said is true, that God has many sons? He said it. I trust him. It's the truth. And then maybe after that we can figure out how does it make sense. And I'm telling you, it can make sense if you stop thinking the way the ego thinks and think the way God thinks. And it's a very, very different way of thinking. Very different conclusions, very different logic, but very sane and very impeccable in its outcome. So, hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to go and get warm. And love to you, and thank you for your patience and listening. Till next time.